This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you again for listening to Beyond the Big Screen, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. A huge thanks goes out to Gil Kidron, host of a podcast of Biblical Proportions. Links to learn more about Gil and a podcast of Biblical Proportions can be found at podcastofbiblicalproportions.com or, of course, in the show notes. You can now support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon. By joining on Patreon, you help keep Beyond the Big Screen sustainable and get many great benefits. Go over to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more. A special thanks goes out to supporter Alex, who is an executive producer of this episode. Another way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to just leave a good old-fashioned rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These reviews really help me know what you think of the show and help other people learn about Beyond the Big Screen. As you are well aware of by this point, I hope at least, we are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Josh Cohen's Eyewitness History Podcast. You can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, how to contact me, the Parthenon Podcast Network, and how to support the show by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. I thank you for joining me again, Beyond the Big Screen. Hi, Gil. Thanks again for coming on with me coming on your show. I'm really excited about today.
Hi, Steven. Yeah, this is a collab about maybe my favorite story of all time, the story of Joseph. Oof, such a good story.
It's really growing on me, too. It's raising up through the ranks of my favorite story. I mean, there's so many good stories, but I think this one is definitely top 10, maybe top 5.
This film that we're going to talk about did an excellent job. I'm really happy with what the writers did.
So this movie, Joseph, King of Dreams, it's really amazing how closely it's stuck to the biblical story from Genesis 37 to about 51. So Joseph doesn't get his own book, but he gets a solid chunk of Genesis to himself.
So apparently the creators of the movie, in their first showing of the movie to all the producers, there was like deafening silence. And the bottom line was, this is horrible. This is not a story. It doesn't work. Nothing fits. It makes no sense. And then they had to go to the drawing board, to go back to the drawing board. Actually, now that I think about it, they did even do like a drawing board, like, the
storyboard or the...
Yeah, storyboard. And they went back and looked like, what's the actual story? Because there are several layers of editing and additions and stuff that doesn't really fit. And they just like found the core of the story, the vision of the story, hang on to it, and just like ignored everything that didn't fit. And as I was watching the movie, I'm like, yes, you got it. You found it. Just like all the things in those chapters that just like interfere with the natural organic progression of the story are not in the movie. So just like, I have a Bible podcast, I have a podcast about films. This could be like a great opportunity for me to just like, say, they didn't understand this movie at all. Let me tell you what it's all about. No, they understood the story, not the movie. They understood the story. They got the story. It's a story about a family feud, about forgiveness, about opening a new leaf. It's a story with a happy ending.
Yeah, and that's amazing. In so many of these biblical stories, there is no happy ending, or there isn't an ending that wraps it up into a nice, neat bow. And we'll talk so much, too, about some of the ideas that you've developed in your podcast of Biblical Proportions about how this book was written. So we're going to be going to movies and literature review. There's going to be a lot going on, and I can't really wait to talk about this.
So just a quick refresher for those of us who have forgotten the main plot of Joseph. The film is called Joseph, King of Dreams, because Joseph's superpower is at the beginning dreaming the future and then interpreting other people's dreams to see the future. He is the favorite son of the third Hebrew patriarch, Jacob, Yaakov, also named Israel. That fatherly love makes Joseph's brothers jealous, they throw him into a pit, they sell him into slavery in Egypt. He starts out as a servant in Egypt, but climbs through the ranks, becomes the number 2 person in the entire land, second only to the Pharaoh. And then when his brothers come, he recognizes, they don't recognize him. And there's a lot of drama. And then by the end, he tells them who he is. He forgives them, asks for their forgiveness. They bring their father, and they're very prosperous and successful in Egypt.
Yeah, and they're a happy family again.
Happy family. The end. It's a happy ending.
With a little bit of extra singing because it's DreamWorks. You got to have some show tunes in there. But for the most part, that is the story of the movie Joseph, Man of Dreams, and then Joseph from Genesis, the last couple of sections of Genesis.
We have to talk about how they show the dream, like Van Gogh painting. Wonderful.
Yeah, I think if you read it, you might have a different imagery for the dreams, but I think that's really how they portray them in the movie is probably how somebody would have dreams like that. It's not going to be literal or a film type. It's going to be these stalks of wheat, and then they fall, and then there's one in the middle, and they're all swirling around. That's how you're going to have a dream of that sort of thing.
Right. They really, I think, all of their dream sequences really do justice to the biblical story. And, it's not easy to do justice to an iconic biblical story. So really kudos for that, for the visuals, because the visuals, I can't say that I imagined it as Van Gogh, but it doesn't matter. The descriptions in the biblical story are very colorful and very grand and wonderful. So that's really apt, the way that they did it. Kudos.
Clearly, Jacob prefers Joseph over the other 11-ish brothers, 10, 11 brothers.
And it does him a disservice.
Yeah, which exactly does him a disservice. Jacob gives Joseph a beautiful coat. They call it the coat of many colors, the tunic of many colors. We'll get into a little bit of this symbolism of that. But I guess in the high level, this coat really makes the other brothers jealous. And just a whole bunch of these dreams Jacob has, or these dreams that Joseph has, really says that Joseph is going to be above all the other brothers.
He's like me.
The brothers really hate it, and they concoct this scheme to get rid of Joseph, where they trick Joseph into getting separated from everybody else. They sell Joseph into slavery.
They throw him into a pit, first of all, right?
They throw him into a pit. They sell him into slavery. Then, to make it look... To Egypt. To make it look like Joseph has just been killed out in the field by wild wolves, they take the coat of many colors, put some blood onto it, give it to Jacob. Jacob's so upset. Then the narrative takes over as Joseph going through being sold as a slave into Egypt. I think he gets sold to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. Then he's sold to the Egyptians for 30 pieces.
Yeah, in the Septuagint, it was sold for 30 pieces.
Which we can talk about some of the symbolism of the 30 pieces of silver, because that kind of set off alarm bells for me.
Yeah, that stands out. They make a really good job at making it, seem reasonable. Everybody is reasonable. All their motives and motivations are reasonable. So first of all, we have to say Yosef, Yasaf. The reason that this is his name is because Yasaf is added on. He's like the added child. That's the explanation that were given earlier in Genesis. And also Joseph is like an added son to Jacob's sons, which are in the Bible are all eponymous characters, which means that they have the name of a people. So Judah, the character Judah, it's a character named after the tribe, the kingdom of Judah, just like given as a character. You have Levi and all that. Those are, we read it in the Bible as if that came first, but that didn't come first. First you had the tribes, and then they wrote as if it originated with one person. And the only son that Jacob has that doesn't have, that is not originated from a tribe is Joseph. His sons are other tribes, but he is just like an added on to the story of the tribes.
Yeah, that's an interesting part of it, is that there's the 12 tribes of Israel. It's the original 9 the original 9 from the first wife of Jacob.
He also has 2 concubines that don't show it in the movie. He has like 4 wives. Rachel is one of them. So according to the writer, the tribes that he liked least, he put them under the lineage of a concubine, or then the least favorite wife, and Binyamin, and then the tribes that come out of Yosef, he liked them, so he traced them to the favored wife of Jacob. This is like a biblical, how do you call it? Street cred. Yeah. Like saying, like, this is these tribes are in my story. Like Levi is a horrible person in Genesis. In the next book, Moses from the tribe of Levi. So they don't mention the fact that Levi in Genesis, it's just like each tribe writing about their own guys being, the best.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Yeah, they're archetypal of the people who, the tribal groups that they would come. Judah's strong and powerful, and he's the firstborn.
He's not even the firstborn. They show him in the movie as if he's supposed to be the leader, but no, in Genesis he's the fourthborn. The first one is Shimon. Okay, about the coat of many colors. So the coat of many colors, I think that this, do you know the Hyksos dynasty that ruled in ancient Egypt? Mm-hmm. In like the 1700s BCE. Yeah. It's like a Canaanite population that took over for 100 years or so. And in the Egyptian iconography, they are dressed in a coat of many colors. Literally. You can Google Hyksos. The first image that you have is an image of a person with a coat of many colors. They are Canaanite herders who became prominent in Egypt. And I think this is the reason for the coat of many colors. It's like a literary symbol to say this person, Joseph, with the coat of many colors, is going to become prominent in Egypt. This is just like one story of several Egyptian stories that we're going to see incorporated into the Joseph story and then the movie.
Would Jacob and his family have been prosperous by Canaanite terms?
They become prosperous in Egypt. So like the Hyksos, like they came from Canaan, but they became prominent in Egypt. And they were herders, and Jacob and his sons, they make a point to emphasize it in the book that they are herders. So it's like the Israelites incorporating, the mystique of the Hyksos, and their imagery is all around ancient Egypt. It's not something obscure with the coat of many colors. I think this is, it just fits too well to be an accident.
It kind of reminds me, though, I've seen pictures of leaders from the 19th century, the 18th and the 19th century. They had pictures of them painted as Romans in togas or in Roman armor or that sort of thing. And I could see somebody maybe 500 years from now getting confused. Well, this picture was painted, we're pretty sure it was painted in the 19th century, but why are they dressed like somebody from 1500 years earlier? Okay. And you could write up a whole story about that if you didn't really know.
Right. So the brothers hate him. Then there's the only lame scene, in my opinion, is the Kung Fu Joseph scene where he beats the wolves.
Yeah,
that's not the sense that I get from Joseph. I think he's delicate and gentle. Don't think he's a Kung Fu master.
Now, maybe we could talk about now is just what are your ideas on how this was written, who wrote it, the story, and when it was written, because I think that will help us place everything into and then we can kind of build around that.
Okay, so I went over it on my podcast, a podcast of biblical proportion. I have a theory. You can call it a hypothesis. The story of Joseph was written in the mid-500s BC. And the historical context was a calamitous disaster that forced tens or even hundreds of thousands of people from the Levant to immigrate to Egypt. This is a real historical event. It was when the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar conquered the entire Middle East. He destroyed Jerusalem. He burned the main temple. And in the aftermath of that disaster, the Hebrews could not get along with each other. This is recorded in the Bible, and they had to immigrate to Egypt en masse. And we know that the descendants of these immigrants, the Jews of Alexandria, for example, they were the most prosperous Hebrew community ever, wrote a lot of stories, translated the Bible into Greek, very successful. So the history of the immigrants following the disaster that pushed them into Egypt in 580-something BCE, that history was adapted into a legend by a wonderful writer called Baruch son of Neriah, Baruch ben Neriah. He was the scribe who wrote most of the chapters of the book of Jeremiah, and he was Jeremiah's friend and scribe. And specifically the character of Joseph, as it is in the book of Genesis, is inspired partly by Baruch's friend Jeremiah and partly on himself, the writer. It's like inspired by real events. I know it sounds odd, but this is how people write. Their DNA is all over their story. So Joseph is to me a symbolic story about that, what happened to that community, the disaster that pushed them to immigrate, but then how they opened a new leaf. So we want to over a little bit the plot of Joseph, so just to illustrate how it was inspired by the real life of the real person Jeremiah. This is the story of Jeremiah's life. He saw the future. He told the sons of Israel, aka the Israelites, the Babylonians were coming to destroy Jerusalem. Everybody hated him for those prophecies. They were jealous of him. That's his perspective. They threw him into a waterless pit. It's not just any pit. It specifically says a waterless pit. And they forced him to immigrate to Egypt because Jeremiah did not want to go to Egypt following the disaster and the burning of Jerusalem and the destruction of Judah.
Yeah.
The sons of Israel in Hebrew, when you read it, Bnei Israel, it could be both the sons of Israel, Jacob, but it's also like a general term for the people of Israel. So it's like the Israelites. And the second part of the story, the success in Egypt, just mirrors perfectly the life of his scribe that became prominent in Egypt. And everything that a scribe would have to do in Egypt fits what Joseph is doing in the story. Collecting taxes, communicating between his brothers, the Israelites, and the Pharaoh and the court. And we know that this person, his scribe, became very, very famous in Egypt. Other people wrote stories about him as a prophet, hundreds of years after he died. He was recorded in all kinds of histories, Josephus Flavius, and he became famous in Muslim folklore and Zoroastrian folklore and Christian. Obviously, you have a statue of him in Brazil, even, as one of the prophets. Basically, what Baruch did was something that writers have been doing from time immemorial. Incorporate their own perspectives, their own life experiences into stories, into art, into the general story that he wants to say. In this case, the story of the exiled community infighting in Israel and then reconciling and opening a new leaf in Egypt and succeeding in Egypt. This is actually something that actually happened in history.
It's an amazing story and it's an amazing way to write a story, to use this ancient folklore, you might say, or this ancient story that was kind of spinning around and then reimagining it to make sense in your own time. It's just a great way to write.
Right. And to deal with in general.
Yeah.
So that would mean that this is all a literary invention, right? Not based on any ancient memory. And I think the amount of Egyptian stories in the Joseph story reinforce that fact. There's the coat of many colors. Then he goes and he's a slave for this minister, Potiphar. And the story about his wife trying to hit on Joseph, that's an Egyptian story. It's called The Two Brothers, a tale of two brothers. One brother is courted by the other brother's wife, and then he runs away. The same story. The dream about the 7 years of famine is an Egyptian story about Imhotep, who was first an advisor, but then later on became deified. And they said that he had a dream about this famine, and the dreams solved the famine. So you watched the movie. What role did God play in the movie?
In the movie, I would say it's more of a guiding hand, you might say. He's
barely.
But yeah, he's behind the screen the whole time. He's not prominent.
And in the story of Joseph, who does he marry? An Egyptian woman whose father is a priest for an Egyptian god.
Yeah.
That's supposed to be like blasphemy or something, but no. They make a point to make the top two tribes for them, Ephraim and Manasseh, to say they are half Egyptian. It's a symbolic way to show that they became integrated into Egyptian society.
It's all under the surface, too, that they never say that there's a problem. When you read that the first time, didn't that set off alarm bells? Wait a minute. His father-in-law is a priest to some Egyptian god and nobody has a problem with that? Like, there's not even like Jacob, a scene where Jacob's like, oh, this is a little sketchy. There's nothing.
No.
Yeah, it's. I think that is one of the key points of the whole text is that Joseph marries an Egyptian girl. He's completely Egyptian in every single way, really, except that he doesn't accept their gods for the most part. But I mean,
for the most part, exactly.
Yeah, because I mean, you have to imagine that he's living in Egypt. His wife's Egyptian. Her dad is a big wheel in the temple. They probably had some dinners of celebrating Set or whatever they do in ancient Egypt. It's not possible.
Which is exactly what actually took place in Egypt with the same immigrant community. When you look at their temples, it's not like the Jerusalem temple. They had all kinds of temples with all kinds of deities together with their own. They had Egyptian names, like Joseph gets an Egyptian name. Later, when Egypt was conquered by the Hellenists, they had a Hellenistic name. None of them were called Joseph or Moses or Abraham, and I think until like the 1st century BCE or something like that. Like for a very, very long time, the reality that we see in the story of Joseph just like fits everything, in real actual history, if you look at it as a symbolic story. So this is this kind of biblical story. Happy ending. Other religions are fine. We don't mind.
What's the connection with the famine? The 7 years of great crops and then the 7 years of just total blight. Is that connected to Jeremiah in some way?
There is a lot of talk of famine in Jeremiah because he chronicles the time that Jerusalem was under siege and that there was famine there. But I think if we look at it from a storytelling perspective, this is very, very complex in terms of plot building. We have to remember, this is like, I think, 550 BCE. And you have several motions of the plot that all connect. And the famine, I think, is the symbolic disaster that is the destruction of Jerusalem that pushed the actual people for whom this story was written, pushed them to Egypt.
Yeah, without the famine, you don't get the instigating event to bring his family to Egypt with their hats in their hands. You need the famine to do that.
Right, to change the power dynamics.
Yeah, the turn. It's an amazing turn.
And if you think about it as a community story, it's just the best kind of story that you could ever have. Like, we're sorry about everything that we did. Even Jacob was at fault, right? He raised his sons not right.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's squeaky clean in this story.
Yeah.
Sorry, forgive and forget, open anew. Now we're in this together, we're family.
I think with this story too, the whole scene when the brothers come when they come from Egypt, both in the movie and while reading it, you want so badly for Joseph to get revenge on them. And that's not going to happen. Obviously, it's the Bible. The ending, even if you haven't read it to the end, he's not going to throw them under the bus or anything like that. But they take you through Joseph's emotional state that he's mad at them. He wants to get revenge. But then the redemption story, it carries you through that completely emotionally. even that you know that the end is not going to be that he has them executed or he gets revenge on them somehow. And I think in a way that makes the redemption story of everybody forgives each other and forgive and forget even better at the end.
Yeah. Let me ask you, what did you think of that scene? What did you feel when you saw that scene that he was an Egyptian now, and we kind of forgot about his past, right? We're like immersed in this Egyptian reality. And the story of Joseph is written, for me, clearly by a person living in Egypt. Just you can smell the whatever. And then he sees his brothers out of nowhere, and it's like very dramatic. As a viewer, for you, how was that like? Was it also dramatic for you?
It was dramatic. I think it was jarring too, because I think you're right that even then, intellectually, you know that there's going to be this conflict coming with his brothers, but that scene where it really hits you in the face that they've come there. The power dynamic, like you said, is completely shifted in Joseph's favor. And what's Joseph going to do with this whole change in dynamic? And I wonder, to throw it back into your court, when you read that for the first time, how did it hit you?
The thing about the biblical stories is that we come in to read them with so much baggage, with theology, just like preconceptions of what this story should be, that it's actually not the first reading that matters. It's actually the story becomes clearer and better the more you read it. Also, it's ancient, so, but a story is a story. So after reading it over and over and over, the story starts to come out. And at the end, it's super dramatic and emotional. And do you know this dramatic technique called dramatic irony?
Mm-hmm.
Right,
sure.
where you know something more that the characters don't know.
Yeah.
And again, we're talking about a story from 550 BCE. There are several dramatic ironies. First of all, we know something that the brothers don't know. We know who Joseph. Then we see the brothers alone, and we see them talking about Joseph, and then we meet and then they meet, and we know something that Joseph doesn't know. And it's a very rewarding literary technique. Like, it's really enjoyable when you know something that the characters don't know. And the way that the first meeting is described is very, very harsh. And he accuses his brothers of being spies. Isn't that random? Spies?
Yeah.
Why? So we're talking about Jeremiah earlier. Jeremiah was accused by the Israelites of being a spy. So here he accuses the Israelites of being spies. You're calling me a spy? You are spies. Very mature. But that's like the backstone.
And Jeremiah's writing a story where he's trying to settle scores in here. I think that is an amazing thing, though, that good stories are good stories, whether they're written 2,000 odd years ago or they're written today. Good stories can be written at any time. It's a part of the human experience, you might say.
And you don't even have to know the original language to understand that the story works.
Mm-hmm.
If the setup works. The guy who wrote this story, he is very, very soulful, very sensitive. He's not proud. His hero, even though he becomes the top Hebrew, he says, no, everything is fine. I'm sorry. We're all in this together. We don't have a lot of artists who write these kinds of stories.
No, it's somebody who understands the human condition.
Exactly. And the ending, I think I might have shed a tear when I watched the movie just because it's so gut-wrenching. You have several scenes in the story, not in the movie, where he has to run into the bathroom and wash his face because he's crying too hard, and it's hard for him not to. I don't remember if everything is in the movie, but at the end when he reveals himself to his brothers, super dramatic in text, super dramatic on film, very emotionally rewarding. Loved it.
The ending, too, I think the way that they put it together in both the text and in the movie is you feel pulled in two directions, that Joseph has lost so much of his life. There's how many years that Jacob and his whole clan have gone on. They've had Benjamin, and Joseph has missed all of that. But Joseph has had his own adventure, which has been in a lot of ways pretty lousy.
Right.
But in the end, it really doesn't matter. Once they decide that they've forgiven each other, then they can move on and be a happy family after that. And to completely give away any resentments that they had against each other. It's really touching. And it really does clean the slate. And you'd think to yourself, could you really clean the slate after that? But they've made the decision to completely start over again. And I think that that's maybe the theological thing that we're supposed to take from it, is that it's true forgiveness. That we're not gonna forgive, but keep in the back of our minds of all the lousy things that they did to us. That once you've forgiven, this is a way to show of complete forgiveness.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is a very important lesson and good lesson for any community, for any society. Unfortunately, I think this is the only biblical story with this bottom line. So we should cherish it. I really feel that this story, it's like a story that there are not a lot of biblical story where you agree with the message and with the thinking. It's like we are being accepted into Egyptian society. We marry into Egyptian society. Their gods are fine. Our gods are fine. We forgive each other. We move on. We help each other. Everything is fine. Let's relax. Let's leave all the hatred behind. Wonderful.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. I had a theory too, and I'd love to run this by you to see what you think about it. I read this, it was more or less during Easter time. So Easter kind of, that term covers over what the true meaning of Easter. In almost every other language, Easter is called something akin to Pascha, where that ties into Passover. In Hebrew, it is Pascha, is what Passover is called. Easter is something else that gets added on in English. And so many English obscures so many things in the Bible, I think, and in all of these stories. But to long story short, the Easter story, the Passover story, is Judas, one of the 12 apostles of Jesus, sells out Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Now, another thing that gets obscured is in the Greek translation. So if you have Judah, the Greeks, to make it fit into Greek, they would add S's to a lot of these words. So Judah turns into Judas, Elijah turns into Elias, etc., etc. Yeshua turns into Jesus. I'm wondering, is that whole thing with Judas, Judah in the Joseph story is the one who comes in completely with his hand in his hand. He knows that Joseph can do whatever he wants to him, but he's legitimately contrite about it. I'm sorry. I'm asking forgiveness. You can do whatever you want, but I'm completely sorry. Where in the gospel stories, you have Judas who does the selling out for the 30 pieces of silver, but he never asks for that contrition. And Jesus doesn't do anything to him. He doesn't kill him. He doesn't do anything. But Judas can't live with that. And in some stories, he kills himself. But he takes it in his own hands, his own retribution, because he never asked for that forgiveness. And I wonder, do you think there's a connection there? Or am I reaching?
No, I don't think you're reaching at all. So several things. First of all, in Hebrew, Judas, Yehuda. As you said, Yehuda ish Krayot. Judas from the Krayot, that's in the north of Israel. So this is a great example of how certain motifs and themes of stories get incorporated and changed over time, and the message changes over time. So I found out a few months ago that the story of Romeo and Juliet wasn't in fact written, from scratch by Shakespeare, but it was a known folk tale, and you have several iterations. And the version just before the one that we have from Shakespeare tells the same story, but the conclusion is different. Is that the parents were right, and you should do what your parents say and just be conservative. The same story, different message, changes across time. when the circumstances change and the context change. So the context of the people who wrote the story of Joseph, their context was actual forgiveness and opening a new leaf and working together. We see that playing out in history. I guess the people who wrote the story of Yehuda, Ishkayot, of Judas, they felt differently. So their final message, it was the same story, the same basic story of selling out for 30 pieces of silver, but they are not contrite, as you said. They should pay. We won't kill them. Does that fit like how they would view Judea?
For one thing, it was a common literary technique of the time to take an established story and then rework it to have a different ending and to draw out different themes. And so it's something that I haven't come to a conclusion myself in my mind of why you would have that different ending. Is it to maybe show that the Judas of the New Testament is that he didn't ask for forgiveness, and so you can't wipe the slate clean if one party doesn't ask for forgiveness.
Yes, doesn't take accountability for its actions.
Yeah, Judah does, and you are able to have full forgiveness. And
yes,
you need the two parties. Joseph is willing to do it. Joseph didn't have to forgive him, and he had all the power in the world to do whatever he wanted, throw them into jail, which he does. He does throw Benjamin into jail, but I think that's kind of just to
keep him close. I think it was also.
And to maybe play out that whole idea that it hurts Joseph to have Benjamin, even though he has all the reason in the world, again, Joseph can be jealous of Benjamin because Benjamin's the new Joseph to Jacob.
Do you know who hails from the tribe of Benjamin? Guess. One guess. Jeremiah. So just by coincidence, his tribe, the eponymous character, he's the only brother who hasn't committed the crime towards Joseph, right? He wasn't there.
Oh, that's huge.
He's not there. And he's of the same mother of Joseph, and he's very special also. Okay. Coincidence?
In the movie, they do such a great job of that, too, where he sees himself in Benjamin. That's how he recognizes Benjamin right off the bat, is that it's like looking in a mirror for him.
Very dramatic. It's very dramatic. What did your son think of this movie? You told me you watched it with your son.
Oh, yeah, he loved it. And I think it was because it's a familiar enough story. I don't think that he knows it exactly. I don't know. Probably haven't read it together or anything, but I think all of the elements of a great story are there. And if you know a little bit about the Bible, little pieces of there, you have things to hook into it that the whole thing plays out. And I think that's what I think is so great about this story is you can dip your toe into it or you can dive way into the deep end of it and you get something new out of that whole adventure of going from, you don't really know much about the story, but as you just keep going, it keeps drawing you deeper and deeper into it.
Right. So I mentioned earlier how they took out the later editions who make no sense in terms of storytelling. So just to illustrate how much it doesn't make sense, we talked at length about all the positive vibes that this story exudes. Suddenly, in chapter 49, it's a chapter that is, for some reason, unironically called The Blessing of Jacob. Suddenly, just imagine all the forgiveness. And now Jacob comes in and he talks to all of his sons and he tells them exactly what he thinks of them, how horrible they are. Each and every one of them is horrible for a different reason. Rants for a whole chapter and how everything bad is going to happen to them. This is just like stuck in just before the final conclusion. If they had that in the movie, just imagine, right? Before the conclusion, just the dad ranting, like, no, you did it to get the message of the story. This is, I think, who would rant about the Israelites at how horrible they are. We have a record of him ranting about the Israelites in his own book Who could that
I
be?
can't imagine who.
It's either
Jeremiah strikes again.
Strikes again. Didn't understand the story of Joseph. Didn't appreciate the story of Joseph, where they respect other deities. Very bitter. So I'm very glad they didn't include that in the story.
I like too how I thought it was a real moment in the movie where, and I think it comes through in the book too, where Reuben says, "Hey, I didn't want anything to do with this. I just want that on the record that this was. I said, let's not do this."
And who hails from the tribe of Reuben? One guess.
Ben Neria.
Yes, Baruch Ben Neria. Their tribes, the right how their tribes are the most awesome, who didn't want to do any of the bad things. They are special. The two biggest actual tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh, are descended from the most special person in the story. So they've given props in this new community that includes immigrants from Judah, from Reuven, from Gad, from all of these places that are the sons of Israel, the sons of Jacob. Actual people who actually had to immigrate after a calamity, after a disaster. They didn't get along before. They put in their story that part of the reasons for all of their trouble is because they didn't get along. And now that they're in a new place in Egypt, these Israelites, actual Israelites, they write a story about leaving all this behind and just understanding that they are family and they should help each other out and just be relaxed about all the theological things and all those problems. No. God is for this. God says that this is good. Happy ending. Boom. Wonderful.
Don't you think too that the story, it gets to family dynamics, and then you can take that family dynamic of brothers just not getting along with each other, and that happens, and that there's some jealousies, but then you layer on that there's a literary analysis to that, and then you layer on that you can take a theological message and a philosophical message.
And
a social message, a historical message, that it's all layered on to this story. It is amazingly done. You know, there's some parts where you could pick out that seem a little disjarring, like Jacob's anti-blessing of the tribes.
But I'm not going to blame the author. I guess he had to just add in that. His story, you can look at it, and scholars agree that this story was written by one person. It's like an author. It's like an epic with everything in the beginning. It's like the Greek prophecy that you can't escape from. The prophecy is you're going to bow down to him. So they, like Oedipus, they send him out to another place. No, you're going to bow down to him now because of what you did. You can't escape. It's like a tragic. This is so many layers to this story, and incorporating Egyptian ancient stories and the personal lives of the authors. What is this? It's too good.
Yeah, it really is. It is really good.